Good morning, Artistry One. I hope you are doing fantastically well, and greetings from the other side of the world. Here today, we are actually in Mesopotamia, which is ancient Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Syria, right in the heart of the Middle East. We are studying one of the most important cultures in the history of humanity. On some level, it's the birth of real civilization, the birth of the city-states, as we'll see. So please enjoy. If you have any questions, please let me know. Today, as I mentioned, we'll be discussing Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, as you can see, lasts from about 4,400 BCE. Imagine that, a culture that lasts for 3,600 years, an enormity in human history. If you think about the United States, we really have been a country for the better part of a little over 200 years now, and we've only really been a superpower since World War II. And so when we talk about Mesopotamia, we talk about this vast expanse and one of the most important cultures for what they're going to invent. Where in the world is Mesopotamia? Well, as you can see, it's in this little area right in here. So we have Turkey, a bit of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, a little bit of Iran. The two main rivers then are right here that are going to form the Mesopotamia, which are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so this area has multiple different names. And in a general overview course like Artistry 1, we're going to kind of put these names, it matters not which one you use. We can call it the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the Fertile Crescent, ancient Iraq, Iran, Syria, Babylonia, Sumeria. Later on, this is going to become the Persian Empire. And later on, a lot of this area is going to be dominated by the Ottomans. So you can see here. So once the actual ancient Egyptian Near East Fertile Crescent area falls, this is a very contested region for a good portion of world history and even today. Some people, like Jon Stewart, one of my favorite comedians, calls this area of the world Mesopotamia because of all of the conflicts and events that have taken place here, including things that involve the United States later on in the battle over oil and control over oil and power, whether that happens to be the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War. So one of the things that shows up we have to ask is that why did ancient civilizations all begin close to large rivers? If we look around, we can look around the Egyptian civilization, giant river there. We can look at Mesopotamian, giant two rivers there. We can look at the Indus Valley civilization, the Chinese civilization, even in our own backyard here in the United States. Most of our early Native American civilizations began right on water close to rivers, such as the Cahokia Mounds culture right along the Mississippi. And of course, the answer of this is going to be water. And that is because if you look at the survival rules of 3, you can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, 3 days without water. And that's right, 3 days without water. And so in a hot climate, this becomes the limiting factor. And yet you can you might be hungry, but you can remain 3 weeks without food. So Euphrates River, if you look on the left-hand side, that kind of flooded or semi-dry area that will flood, that's the Euphrates River before. And then on the right image is the Euphrates River after the annual floods with these beautiful wildflowers. And that is because once the rivers flow over, they bring this beautiful silt, which is very good for growing agricultural crops, at least till the next year when that silt that silt that it got depleted from the year before gets replenished with new floodwaters. That's why these civilizations are developing right on rivers. And here in Miami-Dade College or any other college that you happen to be at, note, you probably have mental health services, and I cannot emphasize enough how important these are. Think about it as in this phrase up here in the upper left-hand corner is a helping hand, not a handout. And you are already paying for these services by being an MDC college student. So if you do need help, by all means, please go and get help. We have free tax preparation, legal services, there's some tuition waivers, there's help for homelessness, there's help for mental health issues, if you're studying from anxiety, depression, mood disorders. So by all means, we also have a food pantry. So please take advantage of these resources. They are there for you so you can better yourself while you get a college education. And to be quite honest, without these types of resources, I might not have made it through college or even be here today. So if you get to know me a little bit from my background, which shows up here, my childhood was spent in near poverty. We were eligible for food stamps basically my entire life as a young boy. I was underprepared by a public school system. I went to a pretty terrible public school system. Um, my elementary school was actually fine, and then my middle school and high school, almost everyone went off into the military that did go into any version of college. I've diagnosed with both depression and secondary PTSD from my work with the United Nations overseas and working with care workers, particularly in genocide areas of the Sudan, in Rwanda. I am the first family member in college who had no one guiding me. So I racked up large amounts of debts, which hopefully I'm paying off soon. And I'm only here today because of psychological help. And today, because of my hard work, but also because I got help, I reached out for those helping hands. I get to collaborate with some of the coolest people on the planet. As you can see right above my head here is me with former President Bill Clinton as part of the Clinton Global Initiatives University, which we are a member institution and we get to go to about once a year. So how was I able to be successful besides reaching out? And this is true, I think, for everyone. If you're willing to outwork, outlast, and outplay, if you're a Survivor fan, you'll know these. If you are willing to outwork everyone, you can always find a place. I try to go out of my way to play nice with everyone. You never know when you might need that helping hand, but also even more importantly, you might not know when that person that you're reaching out to needs that helping hand too. And that can form a friendship, a bond, collaboration in the future for life. I have actually mastered time management. I keep lists every day on what needs to get done, when it needs to get done. And my true calling, I try to leave a trail of excellence in everything that I do. So I almost have never burned a bridge when I go to leave. I might say something that, hey, this could get better to fix, but I always try to put a positive spin and say, here's what does well, and here's how we can do better. And I believe that the meaning of life is helping others. And so it's one of the reasons that I teach at a community college versus a four-year institution or other. I like the idea that all of you students at the community college level are exactly the student that I was, that needed that help. And just that little bit of help has allowed me to do some great things and be involved in some really very cool projects throughout my life, whether that's working on movies and movie rides with Disney, whether that's consulting with the United Nations and working in refugee camps. I helped negotiate a peace treaty in Sudan under the United Nations auspices. And that's all because I was able to reach out and get that helping hand. I would highly encourage you to do the same. Now, one of the things that's challenging about this area of the world, and you see the notion up here, I want to show you Aladdin's challenging opening. Now, even though it's a couple centuries later after our Mesopotamian area, and almost 1,000 years later, it is pretty indicative of how we think about the Middle East. And that is, first off, the first negative aspects of the Middle East come out from the Greeks. Their enemies are the Persians. And so anything the Persians do or anything that ancient Arabia is doing, the Greeks are actually setting up almost a stereotypical image. This is going to be carried over all the way into the modern day world. So we go from Greece, then we have the Christians versus Muslim divide that happens during the medieval Crusades, where these are enemies that are fighting for control of the land. And finally, we have where we are today, where our government and the Western world very much fears the Muslim world. In fact, there's a recent survey out that shows that 44.6% of Americans fear the Muslim religion, literally fear the religion and people who practice that religion. And that is largely because of the propaganda and the ideas of what we've seen them going across. Disney, unfortunately, fell into some of these tropes as well from Aladdin's challenging opening seen here.
land from a faraway place where a caravan camels roam. Where it's flat and immense and the heat is intense. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. When the winds from the east and the suns from the west and the sand in the glass is bright, come on down, stop on by, hop a carpet and fly to another Arabian night.
Now the Disney starts off well here. Look at the beautiful layout of the city here.
It's like Arabian days. More often than not, our hunters will hunt in a lot of good ways. Arabian nights, these Arabian moons, a fool of his God could fall and fall hard out there on the moon.
And so for those of you that know, and I won't show you the rest of the clip, but for those of you who know the rest of the clip, it actually runs through what takes place in this basically 12th century, roughly to 14th century Arabian town, which is actually really not Arabian. It's much more in the area that we're actually under consideration today, Mesopotamia. It deals with things such as cutting off people's hands. It deals with how they deal with kind of thievery and beggary within the process. It's just not a very positive image for a culture that really is one of the first cultures in world history that actually has publicly available laws, and everyone knows what the rules. Even some women had rules, had laws that actually protected them back then, which is just unusual. So the question for all of us is that why do we care? I mean, this is a culture that basically has been extinct since 400 BCE. So why do we care? It may be the most important human culture ever. So this is the place where we get city-states, and you can actually see this slide later. But if you look, they invented the sailboat. The first writing system is from them. They invent irrigation and the idea of agriculture, the first image of God, the first image of laws, the idea of the chariot, the idea of the wheel, which recently now know prehistoric man was using in different parts of the world as well. And if you go back and you know anything about biblical history, if this is in your wheelhouse, whether that comes from the Torah out of the Jewish tradition, from the Old Testament, or the New Testament Christian, if you look at it, this is the area where these stories mostly happen from Iraq. Jonah and the whale would have taken place in Iraq. Daniel and the lion's den, Iraq. The Garden of Eden, Iraq. The three wise men came from Iraq. Noah's Ark from Iraq. So it's very important for Christian history as well. Now, because the three religions called the Abrahamic faith all share the story of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, they all believe in a high monotheistic religion. They all provide the idea of a morality guided by an all-moral, all-knowing God, whether that's Allah, whether that's the word God itself or Jehovah. What we're looking at is that from the Quranic perspective, the Muslim perspective, these same stories are in all three. So the Garden of Eden is just Jannat Adni. The Daniel and the lion's den is Daniel and lion's den. Noah's Ark is Nuh's Ark. They just emphasize different aspects and different aspects of the stories. Like, for example, Noah's Ark in the Christian and Jewish faith is about a giant flood wiping out the evil and kind of starting over. Nuh's Ark from the Muslim faith within the Quran is, yes, about wiping out that evil, but starting over is starting over amongst believers. And so the people that are on the ark are not even all relatives of Noah. They are the relatives or the close confidants, the close friends that are firm, devout believers in the faith at the time period. So the faith will become more important than family. There are even 14 cities that are named from the Bible that we actually can find right now from Mesopotamia. 3 of them that we'll talk about are Ur, Lagash, and Palmyra. Another reason to care, there's going to be a major issue in reshuffling of human population within the next 50 years. And that is because we are running out of clean, fresh water. All over the planet, water patterns are, with global climatic change, water patterns are changing. And so the Syrian war, the civil war that basically has been lasting now for the better part of about 7.5 years, it was our first world war on water. So millions of Middle Easterners over the next 50 years, due to water shortages and the drying out of the climate in the Middle East, they're going to probably have to migrate somewhere. We already have seen this impact on Europe, where there's been this anti-immigration flux that has happened, of people, right-wing nationalism that actually is saying this is for our individuals, this is our cultural history, and we don't want many outsiders or any more outsiders. They're going to destroy that history. Even Brexit within England was largely left as an anti-immigration, particularly from people coming in from the Muslim world in North Africa. And as you can see on the map all the way on the left, which I'll put my cursor on right here, note the orange and the yellow areas. So the area we're talking about today, as well as North Africa, are all drying out. And so the availability of fresh groundwater, those populations keep growing like they have been, there's going to put a tremendous amount of strain on this ecology, and they're going to have to move somewhere. Note where there is water. The water is actually in Europe. It's in the United States. It's in Central Africa. It's in other parts of Asia. And so those people are probably going to have to move to other parts of the world in pretty significant numbers in the next 50 years if the projections for global climatic change are exactly accurate where we are right now. Another issue is that as much as we want to change to a green economy, we are nowhere near that right now. And so we are a hydrocarbon-based economy, a fossil fuel and oil-based economy. And if you look at the huge kind of numbers out of Saudi Arabia, out of Iraq, out of Kuwait, out of the United Arab Emirates, right here in the middle, excuse me, they're the ones who actually are helping to drive the economy with this hydrocarbon. They have surplus, very much surplus of oil, and are willing to sell that. And so as long as we live in a fossil fuel economy, this is going to be a hotbed to control not just the routes and how shipping routes come out, but the pricing index, who gets the oil. That's why many Americans, and we are very close, if not 100% energy efficient today, because we have oil in our reserves, whether they happen to be Alaska or off the coasts, even though we have to worry about the issues of increasingly only using hydrocarbons as we have global climatic change taking place. Now, one of the questions that shows up for Mesopotamian art and for Mesopotamian culture is the following. As this has been a hotbed of problems for us in the United States in recent years, and for the Western world, this real conflict of the Eastern world and the Western world, or what people in Iraq and Iran would talk about is the conflict between the Christian world and the Muslim world, even though we don't see it like that because we like separation of church and state and separation of our government. We're an 82% Christian nation here in the United States. So when we go to war, it's often couched along those lines. The question should be, what should U.S. foreign policy be in the Middle East? I mean, do we take a hands-off approach and allow the oil to flow based upon who wants to let it flow? Do we have a vested interest in the United States of making sure the oil flows to our friends, the people we have treaties with, like the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, because we have enough oil on our own. So do we safe for us to help protect the world's oil supply coming out going through Germany and England and Italy and Spain, France, nations that we actually have a worldwide kind of agreement of democracy and being pro-democracy, and this becomes the issue. So here's the challenge. If you were the US President of the United States, and if you will notice, we have our last three presidents that happen to be up there, President Bush, that's President Clinton in the middle, and President Barack Obama. If you were President of the United States, would you send in troops risking American lives, or send in bombs blowing up this ancient civilization? Because we don't know where the cities, we don't know where those biblical or Quranic cities are buried. We just don't know it. And the last three presidents have all made the same decision. US presidents have all made the decision to send in ground troops, much more than bombing, unless we already know what the bombing looks like. And the reason why is on the tombstone on the right, if you are the US president that authorized Iraq bombings and you happen to destroy a Quranic city that was not in the Bible, was in the Quran, you potentially have just started World War III. You have destroyed basically an irreplaceable city, a holy city from the Bible or from the Quran. And if so, you have a major problem with you in the future. So as we're going through this class, because it's early on in the semester, and in our notes in class, one of the things we have to make sure that is that you know how to take proper notes. Notes might be different in different classes that you're taking. I can tell you from the very get-go that there are 3 things, whether you're doing your readings, your videos, or in-class notes, that I want you to know about an artwork or about the artwork in the art time period. And they are: number 1, for an artwork, why did the artist make the artwork? Was it for political gains? It was for a religious end? Was it to explore their God? What is the reason why they made the artwork? That's going to be question number 1. For question number 2, for what we want to have, is always going to be what's new and innovative about the artwork. That's why artworks make the art history textbooks or the humanities textbooks in classes such as mine. And it's basically the human innovation. What art is, it's the creative human potential and what drives humanity forward. That's what we're looking at when we're looking at this, the human creative potential that shows up. And the third one, which sometimes is not in your book or in your video reading, which I wish more books and academics would focus on, is that what's the impact in the modern day world? Why should a student care about this time period? If at the end of each class, when I ask you about an artwork, I haven't given you that information, then I really haven't done my job, because I have not shown you that there's a direct link that makes that artwork important or important to another artwork, which happens to be important in an artwork today. So when you're doing class note-taking strategy, it matters not to me which of these particular methods that you use. My favorite is the mind map, and that is because if you look all the way on the bottom left, that mind map makes you look and think about a particular artwork, artist, art concept from a conceptual framework, rather than just actually jotting down notes. And so you can use any of these techniques that you want. There was a video this week covering this from College Info Geek, which I highly recommend. If you have not watched, watch. But please make sure you watch before you take your quiz, because there will be a quiz question based upon these strategies that show up. Most of my students will end up taking the outline method of notes. They find that the most intuitive, the easiest, and then if they miss anything, they can always transfer that information over. Now, when we're talking about any culture, one of the ways that we have to look at the culture from an artistic standpoint is what their artwork looks like, how they actually try to manipulate their artwork or their art skills in order to get a style of art that is about their culture, that explains their culture. This is what we call aesthetics. And so the Mesopotamian art aesthetics, I'll give you a moment to write these down. But first off, the concepts are almost always going to be on politics and religion. And when we look at the figural form, we're going to have a columnar body, really with not very many details at all. In low relief, they're going to have a composite pose. What a composite pose is where you have not just full frontal, like I'm looking at you now, but then you can have a profile pose. It could be a 3/4 pose, but they're going to combine all these different elements. And so you're going to get these very strange, almost Egyptian-looking figures. These Egyptian-looking figures, the Egyptian culture is actually going to borrow from Mesopotamia. So it's not really fair to call them Egyptian. It's much more accurate to call them Mesopotamian figures that Egyptians plagiarized or borrowed for cultures. We're going to see narrative registers. What those are is, if you actually look up here with my cursor, going to scroll through, each one of these is a particular scene that tells a part of a story. They're going to have giant wide open eyes. This is the culture that very much believes that open eyes are telling the truth. That if you look someone in the eye, you have to tell them the truth. And so those large open eyes mean that they are really telling the truth. We're going to have hierarchical scale, sometimes also called hieratic scale, which basically means that larger figures are more important. A god is more important than Professor Fraser, so a god is going to be 300 times taller than me, just to give you an accurate. Note, women can be taller than men because women do have some rights here, and the queen is more important than a common man, so the queen can be longer or larger as well. And then finally, to show off their gods, we're going to get our first depictions of gods that we can see. Ooh, let me move this out of the way. There. So we're going to get hybrids of animals and humans, where generally we have the body of a human, but the animal head and the animal upper body to show the strength and power of that particular animal. If an animal has fantastic eyesight, you might see eagle. We still use this phrase today. We call it eagle eye. right? Someone who, a sniper, will have eagle eye vision. They can see things from far away. If we have a powerful figure, they might have a bull like we see in the Minotaur, which is going to be borrowed out of Mesopotamian culture by the Greeks later on. So if you look at these votive temples, and votive just means people that are actually serving devotion. Basically, church looks like how they're praying in front of them. These votive temples, note their eyes are always open. What aesthetics do you see? Is there a columnar body? Do they have composite pose? Do the men have beards versus women? Do they have wide open eyes? Are they larger than smaller than one another? And do we have hybrid animal forms that show up? Finally, are the concepts on politics and religion. That's the aesthetics that we look at when we look at Mesopotamian as an overall art. And there are differences between city-states such as Sumeria and Akkad, but again, in the General Art History 1 course, we won't compare those differences at all. So when you went to buy a votive statue, it was easy as going to the market and you commissioned a local artist in the market to create a likeness of yourself for the temple. If you were very wealthy, you would make it out of wood or higher end material. You might even be made out of stone if you were very wealthy. You could have this blue eye inserted that shows up, which was shell, and then lapis lazuli, a very expensive resource material. If you were poor or middle class like myself, you would probably have eyes that would have nothing in it. And then later on in life, you would actually be able to change one of these votive statues. You would take your old votive statue out, you would bring your new votive statue in. And what was it? It was you were always praying to the god. So no matter where you were, the god and you could actually convene and have a conversation about your life force, about your soul, about how well you were doing in life. So they're devotional figures that are always found in temples. And here's where I am. The Nana moon goddess Ziggurat. Ziggurat is their giant architecture. The Ziggurat's then right behind me, as you can see here. It's for community worship, with only the priests and the kings get to climb up that ramp and go all the way to the top. That means there's a separation between the people who know God, and the priest class, and all of us who need someone to intercede on our behalf to approach the gods. The technique here is just mounded up bricks. They're encased with stone. And this is one of the reasons why we don't know that much about ancient Mesopotamia, is that when it rains, first off, the stones fall off, and any cracks that show up, the mud starts to disappear, particularly over 1,000 years. And so it's one of the reasons why we think oftentimes the Egyptian civilization is much more important than Mesopotamian civilization. We just know more because we found more of the artwork. It didn't melt away. Their building material was literally mud bricks or terracotta that when it gets wet, particularly over thousands of years or cracked, is very easy to damage. And so even though Mesopotamia is way more important to world history than Egypt, we are going to know way more about Egypt because their artwork and their writing still lasts. One of the first questions that shows up is that when we start working together, do humans need religion and why? And note, move this out of the way. Here we go. Do humans need religion and why? So an updated less anti-Islam version of the religion of the world says Islam from the last one. If shit happens, it is the will of Allah. So each of these actually goes through and talks in a very tertiary form about one of the major religious beliefs that show up. Catholicism, as you can see here, if shit happens, I deserve it. Believe in the idea that we are all sinners. We all need to suffer for our sin in some different aspect. And the question we've got to ask is, do we need religion? Because as soon as we develop civilization, guess what? And almost all civilizations, until we get to communism where we outlaw many religions and still people practice on the side, is that we have religion in almost every society. The vast majority of humanity still believes in a god or a god force or a spiritual force. Even today, with all our modern day science, it's still at about 92%. And why do we need religion then? Well, for some people, it provides a moral code that they don't know the difference between good or bad or evil and goodness, and so they need a moral code. Depending on what you believe in science and how science interprets the world, it helps us comprehend the world. It's a sense of belonging. It might give us meaning to our life, where we're going after death. It's really hard to consider your afterlife, as you see in the one before, if you think that you are basically going to be worm food. and that's all there is. So that challenges many people on what they believe, that human and our brains are somehow special. The way that we know so much about Mesopotamian art, or the way we know about a fair amount of Mesopotamian art, is largely through grave goods we're finding. So this is the Queen Puabi of Ur. This is her funerary temple. And note, very high-ranking individual left with this beautiful gold piece headdress. Here you can actually see it. Cylinder seals of her name, and then of various other cylinder seals. Remember, this is the culture that invented cuneiform, or cuneiform. The idea of being able to stamp your name. A lovely bull harp, which I'll show you in a moment. But these are all the funeral goods just in one wealthy woman's funeral in Ur. Again, if we look at the bull lyre, the harp, you can see the different Mesopotamian aesthetics across, and I'll let you find the aesthetics yourself. And notice this is a very good example of narrative registers, which basically become our modern day comic books, where we have one scene and then the next part of the scene, but it might have the same character. And so here's Peter Pringle playing. First, they're going to rotate it for us, but then play what one of these bull lyres would have sounded like from the funeral grades. And so if you look at that bull lyre after listening to some of the music, you'll note each narrative carries a little bit of a different story. So in the very top, you have a nude hero battles with bulls over control of nature, like we will see in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Umbaba, the giant bull creature. The hyenas are going to carry meat, and lion brings drink to the funeral procession. The funeral music being played on a lyre is the third one down, and deceased meets scorpion man who guards the underworld. Note, even in early culture, we're going to see this guarding of the underworld, that not everyone can get in and no one can get out. And so when we look at Mesopotamian afterlife from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we talked about in classes, what is the afterlife like for Mesopotamians based upon the Epic of Gilgamesh? And you'll note it's dark, it's hot, you eat dust, you're alone even though you can hear your loved ones' voices, and everyone goes there, which is an interesting feature. So serial killers and people that are uber moral, very nice individuals will all go to the same place. And so if everyone goes to the same place, it poses an interesting problem, because morality is largely based upon a reward system. What you do, when I want my kids to do well, I will give them a reward system so that if they do well, they'll be encouraged to go do this. This is kind of the opposite system. This is the punishment system, where if you do bad, we're going to punish you. And so their legal system, welcome Steve Harvey.
We asked the haunted American, what is the greatest artwork of all time?
So Steve Harvey is introducing us to one of the 100 greatest artworks of all time. So this is the Stela of Hammurabi. And here's my lovely children that I give that positive reward to in order to get them to do positive behaviors rather than punishing them for when they do wrong, which sometimes we have to do as well. The Stela of Hammurabi, the word stela just means upright stone slab. And so we're going to see a fair number of stela and monuments. Just means that there's an upright stone slab that shows up. They're about 7 feet tall. And note, the same thing at the very tip. We're going to have the exact same features we have to answer their questions to. What Mesopotamian features are here? If you really look, they're almost all here within the process. Now, what makes this particular artwork unique is that this is the first legal code that we have in human history. And that first legal code is based upon this phrase. Keep moving this out of the way. Anu and Bel called me Hammurabi. This is where it starts. The exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to cause justice to prevail in the land, and to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak, nor the weak the strong. And so basically it's arguing for what our legal code is today, that we don't want wealthy, powerful people. We want a fair and just system. And that's what the system is at least starting to argue for. So it's the first legal code. It predates the 500 or the 10 Commandments by 500 years. So by far it's the earliest. Note up on the right, that is the first definitive depiction of God that we have in art. Now, it turns out the Venus of Willendorf is a god. This is going to be our second version that we currently have found. There might be more buried somewhere in caves in the prehistoric world, but currently that's what we have. This is the foundation of divine rule. Note how the god is handing a metal stick over to Hammurabi. It's a hierarchy of the gods. The god on the right stands up. He's going to go off of the screen. It's going to be on public laws and punishments. One of the interesting things is that there are 7 copies throughout the city, so everyone knows what the public laws and the punishments are at the same time. The laws are written in stone, which means you can't change them. So if you've ever heard someone say, oh, I'm going to write that in stone, that phrase really is referring back to Stela of Hammurabi, that those are unchangeable laws. It's really hard to rewrite over stone. It establishes some rights for women, but let's not go crazy here. They're not equal rights. If you want truly equal rights, we should probably head back to the caves of prehistoric world. And the important figures, note the god here, is his feet are upraised on a pedestal. And that largely because the gods and powerful figure were believed to have more energy, more power. In this case, this is the sun god with the sun rays coming off right here, emanating from his body, the way you drew sun rays as a child. His figure then, if he were to come down in a hot climate, he could cause a drought. And so we're going to see that appear over and over. The idea of an eye for an eye from the first legal code, that eye for an eye does not come out of the biblical teaching or the Torah. It predates it by 500 years. An eye for an eye is actually written in one of the laws that I'll show you in a little bit, actually in the Stela of Hammurabi. So here's a quick
Lord,
Muslim interpretation of divine monarchy and how they got their laws.
hear me.
This is from The History of the World, a comedy by Mel Brooks, which is fantastic.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
And I guess that's how we got our 10 commandments.
Lord.
So why is the artwork so important to history besides being the first legal code? Well, part of it is going to be the idea and the establishment of divine monarchy. Who has the right to rule? So in the Stela of Hammurabi, as I mentioned, the sun god Shamash here with the sun rays emanating, sitting on, note, a ziggurat throne, because he doesn't come down all the way to us. Just the priests and kings go to visit him. That staff, that's a metal rod he's going to be handed to. Note what we have here in Egypt, metal rod. Note in the Roman Empire, their metal rod that their legions used to march to when they went off to war had a staff with an eagle on the end. That's where we get our eagle. The scepter of the papacy. The scepter of the papacy here are of kings from England. Note the little circle for the symbol of earth was Christianity dominating on top. And note our eagle on the top of a metal rod. And what happens when things go wrong in the United States of America? We drop our flag down to half-mast, right? On some of them, we are basically making the inclination, going all the way back to the Stela of Hammurabi, that, wow, God must be upset with us. There's some issue that shows up. That is actually the tradition of the half-mast flag when things aren't going well in the United States. It all comes out of the Stela of Hammurabi. Not only that, important figures, their feet do not touch the ground, as I mentioned before, because they can cause drought. So note Zeus wearing sandals right here at the Zeus at Olympia, which later on is going to be our model for the Christian God. And note even Jesus wears sandals. That same idea, that divine power energy. That's how people in the ancient world actually understood power, was this extra energy that was kind of this godlike energy that the rest of it couldn't have, that could cause droughts and problems. So some of the rules that show up are interesting. So the most important, well, I won't say the most important, one of the most important rules is number 2. If anyone bring an accusation against a man, and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if he sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river prove that the accused is not guilty, and he escape unhurt, then he who had brought the accusation shall be put to death. Basically, what this is actually telling us is that, yes, you can accuse individuals, but you better be really sure. Because if you accuse someone and that person jumps into the river, is able to swim and survive with whatever current to the other side of the river, they put you to death. If the person you accuse dies, you take possession of their house. And so it really is a sum game where someone dies. You either drown, or the person that was brought the accusation, that person dies. Why is this? Because the most effective punishment for them is death. Why? Because think about what their afterlife is like. Everyone goes to the same place. So if you want people to behave, the best way in this particular time period is to scare them in behaving. The other thing that shows up is that from this rule, we can pretty easily tell that these individuals here are almost none of them are atheists, because it really is based upon a river god knowing who is guilty and who is not for drowning. And these are giant rivers that they have to cross. Rule number 13. There is no rule 13, because then is now, we don't know why, but rule number 13, go back one, because rule number 13 was considered to be unlucky. And so there is no 13th, they just skip over it. Note in modern day elevators, we do the same thing. And it becomes an interesting feature, because holy men, Jesus and his apostles, lucky number 13 for men, and yet 13 women together, as you can see in the middle image, that's a coven of witches, the most negative number that we have. Rule number 28. If a man takes a woman to wife but have no intercourse with her, this woman is no wife to him. No sex, no marriage. Rule number 29 is exactly the same. If a woman takes a man to husband but have no intercourse with him, this man is no husband to her. And so that is basically no sex, no marriage. Either partner can claim that. Rule number 32 is interesting, because you've probably been told by somebody not to point the finger at someone, probably from grandma. It's an older tradition. Rule number 32. If the finger is pointed at a man's wife about another man, but she is not caught sleeping with the other man, she shall jump into the river for her husband. So in some of them, what we're saying is that if you accuse someone of adultery, the woman actually, whether the woman is the one being accused or not, the woman is the one who jumps into the river. She survives, the gods are saying she wasn't guilty, and they kill you. Because remember, rule 2 number still holds. Otherwise, if she actually dies, then you get to take possession over her house, because you brought out moral things that are rewarded by the gods. Rule number 38, one of our first female women's laws of all time. If a woman quarrel with her husband and say, "You are not congenial to me, you are not nice to me," the reasons for her prejudice must be presented. If she is guiltless and there is no fault on her part, she shall take her dowry and go back to her father's house. It's as if she was never married. So if she has kids and the husband was a jerk, or beating her, or things which later on women were not able to get out of a marriage for, then she would actually take her own children back, and they would be considered hers, not the husband's. Now, this is a pretty amazing thing, because the next time that women are going to have this kind of power is really going to be almost in the modern day world. We're looking at the 1800s in the Western world, whether that's the United States, whether it's in Europe and France. Even if a woman was beaten, she couldn't just take herself out of a marriage. Her husband could do it and end the marriage, or a brother could do it, a father could do it, but the woman herself wasn't able to do this. Rule number 70. Here's where it gets harsh. If a barber, without the knowledge of his master, cut the sign of a slave not to be sold, the hands of this barber shall be cut off. They would literally cut off the hands, because their belief was that once you were in public, you had to be on your game face 100%. If you were tired, go back and take a nap. If you were drunk, don't do it. If you had some kind of illness, you should stay at home so you're not infecting others. Anytime that you were out in public, you were meant to be 100% a public citizen, a public servant. That's what it meant to be a member of a city state. And if you weren't prepared to be fully engaged, on time, interactive, get all the directions right, then you had no business being in public. So much so, if a builder built a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Rule number 73 gets harsher. If it kill the son of the owner, the son of that builder shall be put to death. Why? Because back then, as many professions today, we have cop families, we have doctor families, where the son becomes a doctor. Back then, you learned your craft from your father. And so if your father's a terrible builder, why would they want you building as well? Right? You're learning terrible techniques. And so let's just end the family line, let someone else try out building. And rule number 87, and this is how we know it's largely not an atheist, this is a God-fearing culture. If anyone who has not lost his goods state that they have been lost and make false claims before God, even though he has not lost them, he shall be fully compensated for all his lost claim. The oath is all that is needed because they know God will punish you otherwise. And the afterlife is very clear. So if God punishes you by taking 5 years off your life, you end up drowning, getting bitten by a snake, house falling on you. It was your fault in some capacity. So we have God fearing. And so all I would have to do is say, dear God, dear Shamash, I am so sorry, but I would love to ask, my Lamborghini got stolen. Actually, my wife's Lamborghini also got stolen. Our big screen TV also was stolen. Can you please replace it at taxpayer expense? I am very sorry. If I am willing to make that claim, I would get my 2 Lamborghinis and my big screen TV back. And it would be at taxpayer expense, knowing that if I lied through that process and we believed in the God and fear the God, that God was going to smite me dead anyway. So as we are looking forward, and so this is generally where we end class 1 on Mesopotamia and begin class 2. So I'll end here and pick up here in a couple of moments for class 2. It's a review as we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh and where we go from Mesopotamian culture. Have a lovely day.